Bible says that God designed life, that God placed the information into our DNA. According to our kind is what we will give birth to. According to our kind. And that's what we see happening in creation today. And that's what happened from day one. From our kind, according to our kind. What about mutations? Are they able to bring about the changes evolution demands? You know, scientists say this. And he's not a creationist, a mathematician, a statistician. There's no chance, 10 to the 1,000th power, that's virtually no chance at all, to see this mechanism, mutation, appear spontaneously. And if it did, even less for it to remain. What he's saying is, scientifically, if there are changes, virtually all of them hurt the organism. They don't help the organism. And it's not passed on to the offspring. God's designed within biological life this amazing process in which mutations are overcome by the population of the other organisms. They disappear because they hurt the organism. They don't help. That's part of God's design. He goes on and says this, thus, to conclude, we believe there is a considerable gap in the neo-Darwinian theory of evolution. And we believe this gap to be of such a nature, he's saying, this gap is so big that it cannot be bridged within the current conception of biology. Absolutely no possibility of mutation leading to all the different forms of life that we see today. You know, scientists have been working on the fruit fly for a while. I hope you know that. Very simple organism, relatively speaking, the fruit fly. They've been endeavoring to make mutations in the fruit fly. All of the mutations that they have come up with are harmful or harmless. There's no advantages. And that's what Darwinian evolution demands. The only changes that are passed on are ones that give that organism an advantage. That's why it's passed on, according to Darwinian evolution. None of the mutations they have seen on the fruit fly. Now remember, already the model breaks down. Why? Because these are scientists working on the fruit fly. There's an intelligent being working on that fruit fly to bring about mutations. But even when that's happening, remember Darwinian evolution says it's natural selection. There's no intelligence involved. It's natural selection. But even when scientists are working on the fruit fly, can't come up with any changes that help the organism at all. You know, they haven't come up with a fruit fly that's sitting around reading the newspaper. I mean, it's just not happening. Those changes have not been found, right? It's always going back to a normal fruit fly. We have yet to find, now listen to the power of this statement. We have yet to find a mutation that increases genetic information. There's not one. There's not one mutation that's ever been seen that ever is a result of an increase in genetic information. That is what is demanded by evolution. Our genetic information in our bodies is much more complex. The amount of genetic information is much greater in us than in that simple-celled organism in the very beginning. So the increase had to be massive. Never seen. It's never happened. Never been any increase in genetic information ever. They don't tell that to our students in public schools. They don't even tell that. That's not even discussed in universities. It's not out there because it speaks against evolution. But you never hear that. Why? Because it speaks to a designer, God, who created us and made us in his image. Here's another thing you need to know. You need to say, complex, specialized organs cannot be formed by evolution. Think about the eye, for example. We'll get back to that in a second. How does the eye suddenly appear? Because in the beginning, there were organisms without an eye. How does an eye suddenly develop in evolution? And we're going to see how that cannot happen. The first big problem is this. Cells that should be very simple, if evolution is true, simple to complex, that's the whole mantra of evolution, are actually not simple at all, but extremely complex. Let's go back to those one-cell organisms. Darwin did not have an electron microscope. We do today. Darwin thought these simple organisms were just that, very simple. We're finding out just the opposite. We're finding out a complexity at the very beginning, quote unquote, of the evolutionary process that boggles the imagination. Watch this clip.
In the 19th century, when Darwin was alive, scientists thought that the basis of life, the cell, was some simple glob of protoplasm, like a little piece of jello or something that was not hard to explain at all.
This perception didn't really change too much until the early 1950s, but in the last half century, our knowledge of the cell has just exploded.
Today, powerful technologies reveal elaborate microscopic worlds. Worlds so small that a thimbleful of cultured liquid can contain more than 4 billion single-cell bacteria, each packed with circuits, assembly instructions, and miniature machines, the complexity of which Charles Darwin could never have imagined.
At the very basis of life, where molecules and cells run the show, we've discovered machines, literally molecular machines. There are little molecular trucks that carry supplies from one end of the cell to the other. There are machines which capture the energy from sunlight and turn it into usable energy.
There are as many molecular machines in the human body as there are functions that the body has to do. So if you think about hearing, seeing, smelling, tasting, feeling, blood clotting, respiratory action, the immune response, all of those require a host of machines.
When we look at these machines, we ask ourselves, where do they come from? And the standard answer, Darwinian evolution, is very inadequate in my view.
Amazing molecular machines in the simplest, quote-unquote, of cells that scientists cannot understand. It points to a designer. God placed them there, all these machines in the simplest of cells doing what needs to be done, speaking against evolution. And this is what Darwin said. If it could be demonstrated, you'll see this quote again, that any complex organism existed which could not possibly have been formed by numerous successive slight modifications, my theory would absolutely break down. Well, the cell, the very simple one-celled organism is a great example of that. There are all these biological complex machines within this simple cell. That would break down that theory. It isn't just a glob of jello. It is incredibly complicated. Darwin's Black Box is the book by Michael Behe, in which he is a biologist that really argues persuasively that biochemical machines must have been designed either by God or by some other higher intelligence. They just cannot appear like that at the beginning of evolution. You can't have this simple little celled organism with all these biological machines running around inside that have specific jobs and are doing amazing things. Can't happen at the beginning of evolution. Goes contrary to their theory. That's not told to our students in schools today, and you certainly don't hear it. Well, let's go just one biological machine. Here's another clip I want to show you.
I remember the first time I looked in a biochemistry textbook and I saw a drawing of something called a bacterial flagellum with all of its parts in all of its glory. It had a propeller and the hook region and the drive shaft and the motor and so on. I looked at that and I said, that's an outboard motor. That's designed, that's no chance assemblage of parts.
Howard Berg at Harvard has labeled it the most efficient machine in the universe. These machines, some of them are running at 100,000 RPMs and are hardwired into a signal transduction or sensory mechanism so that it's getting feedback from the environment.
And even though they're spinning that fast, they can stop on a dime. It only takes a quarter turn for them to stop and shift directions and start spinning 100,000 RPM in the other direction.
And just like outboard motors on motorboats, it has a large number of parts which are necessary for the motor to work.
The bacterial flagellum, 2 gears, forward and reverse, water-cooled, proton motive force. It has a stator, it has a rotor, it has a U-joint, it has a drive shaft, it has a propeller, and they function as these parts of machines. It's not convenient that we give them these names. That's truly their function.
They're very complicated and complex machines, biological machines. And there are evolutionists that will look at that and try to explain it. And there was one individual that I met at a debate that I was at, watching our own Tim Darms debate at a university, at a college right in the area. Went there, and they asked for questions from the audience, so I raised the question of Michael Behe's concept of irreducible complexity and how these amazing biological machines occur in these very simple, quote-unquote, organisms. How can that happen? How can that develop early in the process when it's so complex? Did you hear that quote? The most efficient machine in the universe.